Let's start. Good news is that Victor has probably allowed me to shorten about another page of this paper. I knew with him I would be preaching to the converted. I want to just say a little bit about method. Victor is not the only person who sometimes starts a talk here by saying, well, I'm not a philosopher. Thank heavens, you will not notice an awful lot of philosophers here. Can you open that? Yeah, please. But I am a philosopher, and not a historian. And what that means is I read more history than I read probably anything else, certainly more than I read philosophy. But what interests me about history is not what historians find in archives, although I'm grateful to them and I often learn things from them, but it's about what ordinary people, ordinary educated people, understand as public history, okay, what our worldviews are. This talk is a very shortened version of the last chapter of a book I've been working on for some time titled Heroism for an Age of Victimhood. And it will include portraits of 4 people who are heroes of mine, ending with Paul Robeson. So please do correct me if I get something wrong, because it's not done yet. This project was fueled by 2 concerns. One is the fact that sometimes shortly after the mid-20th century, the subject of history shifted. For thousands of years, in fact and in fiction, heroes were the centerpiece of earlier narratives, whatever kind of hero they were. And today, the desire to be heroic has receded before competitions over victimhood. Now, the shift of focus to the victims of history began in demands for justice. But if we view victimhood itself as a source of legitimacy, we're on the way to untying legitimacy from agency altogether. What counts is less what you do in the world than what the world has done to you. And the other concern that drove me in this project is the claim that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, which suggests that it's impossible to decide whether someone is a hero. It's all a matter of where you stand. I think this is lazy. While there are no necessary and sufficient conditions for deciding if someone is a hero, it's possible by studying lives and works to make reasonable claims that someone was a hero. I've argued that heroes aren't saints. Flawless heroes only live in cartoons. In order to see them as useful examples for other mortals, we have to countenance flaws. So the question in every case of someone you want to examine, whether or not she was a hero, the question is just how many. Now, those who know anything about Robeson would agree that representing the peak of human achievement under such difficult conditions in so many ways give him as good a claim as any to count as heroic. But many people think his unbending support of the Soviet Union was a fatal flaw. By the way, I do distinguish between the Soviet Union and the GDR. As I think it was Heiner Müller who said, GDR left behind mountains of files, not mountains of corpses, okay? Now, the speakers at this conference, of course, chosen for their knowledge of Paul Robeson, are an unusual group, and some of what follows will be preaching to the converted. But even many who lean towards some version of socialism are all the more intent on pointing out the defects of real existing state socialism. Just this week, I read articles in Dissent and The Nation, two of the oldest socialist journalists in the US, devoted to the task. And if you want to provoke fury among West Germans, just try saying what Victor said about East Germany. I have said and written such, vetted by two historians, and I still get hate mail about it. I understand the impulse of those who consider themselves socialists to criticize the paths taken by various parties who considered themselves communist, but I believe our case is better served by reminding, especially those whose memories reach no longer than the end of the Cold War, what was at stake in the battle between communism and fascism. Even during the Cold War, Robeson had to remind people, and I'm quoting, the first people who understood the struggle against fascism and the first to die in it were communists. Now I'll begin with a philosophical claim. Anyone who equates communism with fascism assumes that ideas are trivial. The identification has become so automatic, and not only in the United States. In Germany, there are literally monuments to victims of the two German dictatorships. There's a fundamental difference between a worldview that is principally racist and nationalist and one that insists upon the equality of all nations and classes. Those who overlook that difference to focus solely on similarities of method are those for whom ideas do not matter. Of course, body counts matter too, and that is the tragedy not only of Paul Robeson, but of the 20th century. My own teacher, John Rawls, once told me that the Holocaust was the moral question of the 20th century. Decades later, I came to think he was wrong. It's no surprise that brutal ideas led to brutality. More pressing is the question of how ideas of universal justice could turn into Stalinist hell. One could even argue that Stalinism was worse than fascism, for Stalinism perverted and ultimately undermined the hopes for a society not based on material or national hierarchies. Rather than fully face it, let alone mourn it properly, or address the question seriously of how noble ideas can have terrible consequences, I think many of us have been engaged in a monumental act of repression. Not all of us. Shout out to Penny Van Eshen's wonderful book, Paradoxes of Nostalgia, which explains how in the early 90s, the combined forces of the economy, the government, and popular culture all combined to make us believe that lie. I'll continue with a truism. Morality is not politics. Even moral quandaries can remain insoluble, of course, but nearly every form of political action in this world involves choosing some version of the lesser evil. Even participating in elections requires compromises. Did you ever vote for a candidate with whom you deeply disagreed? Did you ever hold your nose while voting for one you found thoroughly despicable in order to prevent someone worse from taking office? If you did, you should be congratulated. Those whose moral purity led them to sit out the supposedly inconsequential U.S. election of 2000 have the war in Iraq and the climate crisis on their hands. Grown-ups learn to live with compromises, perhaps even betrayals of their ideas. And if anyone eligible to vote in the U.S., you know who I'm thinking of, is thinking of sitting this one out because of disgust with Biden's support of the wars in Gaza and Lebanon, that's just what Bibi Netanyahu wants. Come talk to me about it. When the weight of accumulated betrayal becomes too heavy, you step off the track. But different people can carry different weights. Only in hindsight did we decide they were straining too hard. The question of where to draw the line for a candidate who seems dubious is a question of judgment, and judgments are bets on the future. You could be wrong. Even worse, the outcomes of your judgment are rarely in your hands. Since the end of the Cold War, many who spent decades arguing over just which version of Marxism was correct, in decade after decade of night after night in smoky rooms, have rushed to insist they always knew it led straight to the Gulag. But the interesting thing is not how many of us would have joined the CP in the 20s and 30s, but when we would have quit. The Moscow trials, the extent of the terror was known only to a few, and even then, Kessler's brilliant Darkness at Noon showed how a condemned comrade in the Lubyanka might justify his continued loyalty. The pact between Hitler and Stalin, even the Trotskyist historian Isaac Deutscher thought Stalin had no choice but to align with the enemy after the other great powers refused him. Stalin's late, murderous anti-Semitism, the invasion of Hungary. It's useless to say that one should never have stepped on the slippery slope in the first place without recognizing that we all step on some if we're going to move politically at all. When do you abandon the idea of America as a general force for freedom and democracy? After the CIA made quick common cause with the leading former Nazis in Germany, U.S. presidents refused to support a federal law against lynching. After the U.S. overturned democratically elected governments in Guatemala, Iran, or the Congo, or their support of apartheid South Africa, after all, they were anti-communist. What about the wars in Vietnam or Iraq, the election of Donald Trump? In 2019, former President Jimmy Carter called the United States the most warlike nation in the world. Not a comment that got a whole lot of play in the US press, but you could find it. If I've not entirely given up on America, it's because the country has always spawned people like Robeson, who demanded that America's realities come to reflect its ideals. Many black and white Americans visited the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s. When Robeson came in 1934, his stated purpose was to study Soviet policy on minorities in Central Asia. He knew they contained large populations of color, and he hoped the policy might provide a model for America and Africa. Official Soviet policy towards their republics reflected his own worldview: nationalist in form, socialist in content. So what do you see on that first visit? Some early communists were opposed to any form of nationalism, but Lenin was adamant nations were facts, if only because of differing languages, and it was foolish to deny facts. By the early 1930s, the Soviet Union recognized over 100 different nationalities with varying degrees of autonomy within its borders. According to the Russian historian Yuri Slezkin, the Great Transformation of 1928 to 32 turned into the most extravagant celebration of ethnic diversity any state ever financed. By the end of the 30s, each republic had its own theaters and libraries, opera company and writers' unions, and an academy of literature and history, though many of their citizens had been illiterate 20 years earlier. A polyglot like Robeson must have rejoiced. And married to a talented and independent woman, he was also impressed by the Soviet Union's pioneering steps towards women's rights. The republics remained equal in principle, but under Stalin, an ethnic hierarchy was tacitly introduced, and the Russians became increasingly dominant. Still, cultural institutions, Daniel, I believe in them, cultural pluralism, Cultural institutions had already been established in each of the republics, and ethnic groups were urged to redouble their efforts to build distinct national cultures. We actually once had an Einstein fellow whose project was on Soviet opera in Kazakhstan. It was quite fascinating. He was Kazakh. Any drawbacks must have seemed trivial at a time when a man as black as Robeson couldn't sit down for a cup of coffee in much of the United States, and when African American culture was just being recognized as culture at all, largely thanks to Robeson's own efforts. For Lenin, racism, imperialism, and capitalism were inextricably mixed. Stalin's constitutional amendment forbade discrimination based on color or language 30 years before such a law could be passed in the United States. Moreover, the Soviet Union proclaimed a deep appreciation of the power of culture, a view that must appeal to every artist and intellectual, particularly one who, like Robeson, already believed that music is the quickest way to foster understanding between peoples. The downside, of course, was that artists and intellectuals were more carefully watched, and worse, including Robeson's own friends. But this was less apparent in the early 30s, and like many African Americans who visited the Soviet Union at the time, Robeson focused on something else. While the first visit to Russia didn't commit Robeson to socialism, though he is impressed by what he saw there, the Spanish Civil War did the rest. While Franco received nearly unlimited arms from Germany and Italy, American auto and steel industries supplied his forces with millions of dollars worth of supplies. British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden and many others in the Tory-led government believed the fascists served more British interests than the loyalists, who had broken up the large and largely feudal estates which had controlled Spanish politics before they were elected. When Britain and France accepted Hitler's occupation of Czechoslovakia, those who'd followed Western policy in Spain saw their worst fears confirmed. Fascism was preferable to anything that might support socialism. As Robeson himself put it in 1958 in his book Here I Stand, describing England 20 years earlier, in the great country houses where I'd often been welcome as a guest, having tea and exchanging smiles with Lord and Lady this and that, a quiet serenity prevailed. Hitler and Mussolini, well, they might be thought to be bounders, uncouth fellows really, and quite unacceptable socially, but upper-class England was rather pleased by what the dictators were doing, end quote. Emboldened by Western responses in Spain and Munich, Nazi Germany continued its advances. Yet both Hitler and Mussolini thought Franco's reign of terror was too brutal. After all, he'd publicly stated that he'd prefer the death of half the Spanish population to seeing them go communist. But what about the Hitler-Stalin Pact? It's surprising that eminent historians are among those who raise the question. The archives clearly show that the Soviet Union made many overtures to Britain and France seeking a defensive alliance against Nazi Germany. And you don't even have to go to the archives. Based on archival evidence, there was a good film produced on Arta a couple of years ago. That those efforts failed was no real surprise, given that American, British, and French forces intervened from 1918 to 1922 to fight the young Russian Revolution. It's understandable that, in the absence of other alternatives and beset in the East by Japan, who had won a war against Russia in 1905, Stalin felt the need for a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany until he could bolster Soviet military defenses. This, although Hitler had written, quote, "The destruction of Bolshevism, which is Germany's essential task, is the ambition of my life and the raison d'etre of National Socialism." This point has been almost forgotten today in the current popular history and political writing, which reduces fascism to anti-Semitism. In one of the many investigations questioning his loyalty to the U.S., a congressman's suggestion that Robeson's proud commitment to socialism rested on propaganda he'd imbibed during sojourns in Russia. Robeson quickly corrected him. His political education, he said, took place during his years in London, where he consorted sometimes with aristocrats, but more often with labor theorists and activists like George Bernard Shaw, Emma Goldman, C.L.R. James, H.G. Wells, Jawaharlal Nehru, and many others. Like his friend Albert Einstein, Robeson was temperamentally suited for socialism. He always spoke warmly of the strength and wisdom of the black community in which he was raised, though most of them, including his revered older brother, were denied the opportunity to realize their talents on a larger scale. He remained friends with many till the end of his days, and this is how he described them, quote, "Hardworking people and poor, most of them in worldly goods, but how rich in compassion. How filled with the goodness of humanity and the spiritual steel forged by centuries of oppression. There was the honest joy of laughter in those home, folk wit and story, hearty appetites for life, as for the nourishing greens and black-eyed peas and cornmeal bread they shared with me." End quote. Now, following that accidental meeting with the Welsh miners in 1929, he gave thousands of free and benefit concerts for causes he supported, from Jewish refugees in London to striking steelworkers in Michigan. To the consternation of his producers, he also began insisting that tickets to most of his performances were priced at sums ordinary workers could afford. More importantly, he began to think differently about the purpose of his art, and saying that art should show the way the world ought to be. Discovering that he had the power to stir souls, Robeson determined to sing songs that would move people toward greater freedom and dignity and universalism. He liked to pair songs of the Spanish Civil War, like Los Cuatro Generales, with the American Battle Hymn of the Republic, the Yiddish partisan lead with the black spiritual Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel. Many cultures have traditions of song that protest injustices that rule their lives. Part of Robeson's genius was to bring those traditions together, creating a canon of resistance songs that inspire hope today. He understood that universalism and socialism, understood properly, go together. Understood properly. Many progressives today confuse universalism with globalism. And if globalism assumes any kind of universalism, it's the universal desire for commodities. True universalism affirms not only universal rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but the means to realize those rights, which is why universalism and socialism go together. Since the Cold War, the belief that we have a perennial yearning for radical justice gave way to the neoliberal assumption that the common good we're most likely to share, common goal we're most likely to share, is the acquisition of the latest iPhone. And it's not by the way that it's not just neoliberals who share that assumption. It's certain forms of Marxists who say, hey, you know, it's the economy, stupid. As Margaret Thatcher put it, economics are the method. The object is to change the soul. Now, as the Cold War grew hotter, Robeson became increasingly radicalized. As he said in a 1946 speech to the Central Conference of American Rabbis, since the first days of the American Revolution, Jews and Negroes have fought together. There were men of Hebrew faith in John Brown's brave company of men. The slander and vilification of the Soviet Union stems from the same reactionary quarters as does the slander against the Negro, the Jew, and other minorities. End quote. And as we've heard now a number of times, his downfall came with the Paris Peace Conference of 1949. He had committed two unforgivable sins, criticizing U.S. policies while standing abroad and praising the Soviet Union. Together, both sins produced cries of treason, and the resulting outrage was as intense as the previous adulation. Most painful for Robeson was criticism from the black community. They'd been proud of him for representing their own best qualities and basked in his reflected glory. Now they feared he would undermine their own claims to be real Americans, when the suspicion they were not has plagued American history to this day, as we saw in the case of Barack Obama. Old friends denounced and even informed on him. In the only instance I ever found of FBI scrutiny that was amusing, an agent found a list of Chinese characters that fell out of Robeson's pocket in a taxi cab. Convinced it was a secret code Robeson was using for espionage, the agent could not imagine that it was, in fact, an instance of the method Robeson had developed for learning more languages. The press portrayed him as a Soviet agent, and as Robeson later wrote, quote, "It should be plain to everybody, and especially Negroes, that if the government had a shred of evidence to back up that charge, you can bet your last dollar they would have tried their best to put me under the jail." Though clearly not a Soviet agent, at no time did he publicly criticize the Soviet Union. The closest he came to doing so was during a Moscow concert in 1949, when Stalin's anti-Semitic purges were swelling. The public gesture he made was to dedicate the Partisanenlied, a resistance song written in Nazi-occupied Poland, to two Russian Jewish friends. He publicly expressed regret over what he called the premature death of one of them, the actor Solomon Michaels, since he'd been told of his execution that morning by the other, the poet Itzi Pfeffer. The audience gasped at Robeson's warm dedication to Michaels and Pfeffer, but when the concert was broadcast to 180 million Soviet citizens, the censors cut that speech, as well as the 20-minute standing ovation which followed that defiant song. Now, it's arguable that Robeson could do no more for tactical reasons. Pfeffer was a prisoner in Lubyanka. After Robeson was unable to contact him and insisted that his hosts find his friend, Pfeffer was released for a few hours to visit. Through a note passed in their meeting to circumvent the bugged hotel room, he asked Robeson to write a private letter on his behalf, together with two other prominent international figures. And one was Howard Fast, and then there was someone else I've forgotten, hoping that those figures were prominent enough that Stalin might listen. Robeson did contact the other two and delivered the joint letter to Stalin by courier. 3 years later, when Robeson accepted the Stalin Prize, he would not yet know the letter had been useless. Pfeffer was killed in the last wave of executions before the dictator's death. And despite Khrushchev's revelations in the 20th Party Congress, Robeson never spoke out publicly against the Soviet Union, and when asked why he didn't, he said it was the business of the Soviet people, not that of an outsider. Now, faced with those facts, there are many people, including biographers, who are inclined to throw up their hands and call the enigma on a tragedy. And those who try to explain the enigma have sometimes done worse, falling back on the assumption that he may have been a greater artist than a thinker. They call him naive. The view is as foolish as it is condescending. While Robeson was never a university professor, though he was offered a professorship in the newly independent Ghana, his scholarship was serious, broad, and acclaimed by many, including the universities in several countries who gave him honorary doctorates. Because his travels were enriched by by more languages than most people have, it's likely he was far less naive than most of his critics, since his understanding of political events was enriched by myriad perspectives. Hence, he was often ahead of his time in attacking, for example, U.S. support for the French colonial war in Indochina. Finally, those who attribute his support of the Soviet Union to a lack of critical intelligence should note that his views were no different from those of his good friend W.B. Du Bois. While Robeson had great affection for the man he called our greatest scholar, there's no indication that he derived his own views from Du Bois. In fact, according to a book called The Professor and the Pupil, Robeson often influenced the older man. In the 1950s, Du Bois spoke of his own frustration that decades of his later writings, in which he defended his growing commitment to universalism and to socialism, were ignored, while everyone wanted to talk about the souls of black folk. And it's a great book, but it was one of the first things he wrote. When it was initially proposed that the Center for African Studies at Harvard be named after the university's first black graduate, it was objected that he was a communist. The W.B. Du Bois Center at Harvard has done much to enhance the reputation of its once forgotten namesake, but less to answer the question, how could men like Du Bois and Robeson share an allegiance to communism? There's a nationalist answer, now commonly given for both men. In the United States, the Communist Party was the first to unequivocally condemn racism, as seen as its defense of the Scottsboro Boys. While the Communist Party immediately clamored for their defense, the establishment NAACP, at that time run by by Du Bois, initially saw the unlettered Scottsboro Boys as too risky to champion. Now, Robeson was as defiant and unbending as ever a man was, but as far as I know, maybe someone here will correct me, he never mentioned the Scottsboro Boys, whose trial took place before his own real period of political activism began. No one ever called to testify before the HUAC was so unwavering. Turning the hearings into his own stage, Robeson responded to the senator who asked why he didn't stay in Russia. Most of you here will know this amazing quote. Because my father was a slave and my people died to build this country, and I'm going to stay here and have a part of it just like you, and no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear? Robeson's success had been used by Americans in power to suggest that the country was no longer racist. Where else, asked a congressman, could the son of a slave occupy such a respected social position in one generation? Speaking out abroad reflected Robeson's determination that his success not be abused. So no one was a bolder advocate for black liberation than Paul Robeson. And connecting colonialism in Africa with racism in America, he made that advocacy worldwide. Yet trying to explain his commitment to the Soviet Union by excusing it as an unfortunate product of black nationalism is almost as patronizing as any other sort of apology. To suggest that Robeson missed the larger picture because his eye was focused on the needs of his people is but a finer form of condescension. He made this clear in his one book, Here I Stand, highly to be recommended if you haven't read it, largely written to explain himself to the African American community, so much of whom had turned on him in the early 50s. They'd swelled with pride at his claim to represent the quintessential American in the Ballad for Americans. Now their own status was threatened by a campaign that branded him un-American. Yet even as he was making his case to a largely black audience, even as he was making his case to a largely black audience, which he hoped to inspire to civil rights activism, he insisted on universalism. Writing of the early successes of the civil rights movement, he wrote in 1959, "This is obviously not a race war. It turns rather on the idea of peoples that are free and those that are not free." End of quote. Robeson once said, "Sometimes I think I'm the only Negro living in the world who would not prefer to be white." In 1925, he became the first person to fill a concert hall with African-American spirituals at a time when they were regarded as lowbrow slave songs, if they were regarded at all. Middle-class black people were embarrassed by them, though not Du Bois, who attended that first concert. Like Robeson, he saw the power of that music as expressions of the hope and resilience of a people enslaved. And later in London, Robeson met young anti-colonialists like Kenyatta and Nkrumah and began to study African languages. He became committed to Pan-Africanism and the idea that the African continent must determine its own fate. Yet his self-respect as a black man and an emblem of black culture was never in conflict with his hunger to perform Shakespeare or Spanish freedom songs or Russian folk music. On the contrary, he believed that folk music best reflected and strengthened our common humanity, and, as we've heard, spent years studying music theory in an effort to show that all folk music derived from common patterns. Robeson, in short, was a passionate universalist without ever succumbing to the Eurocentrism which mars some alleged expressions of universalism. He never saw a contradiction in celebrating cultural difference while insisting on universal values. And if you're feeling provocative, as I sometimes do, you might call him a hero of cultural appropriation, a concept he would have rejected entirely. On the contrary, he believed that working to enter into another culture is the only way to understand another people's humanity as well as your own. There's a logical contradiction between feeling pride and joy in the culture you were born in, as well as an interest and love in the culture of others, but how many actually pull it off? Walking that tightrope demands serious study of other languages and cultures, as well as the ability to navigate between nationalism and universalism. These are so rare that one black reviewer of Robeson's book, Here I Stand, wrote, I quote, "Robeson had two distinct personalities, one of the militant advocate of racial equality and human rights, the other of an advocate of socialism." End quote. One fears the reviewer missed important passages like this, quote, "This belief in the oneness of humankind, about which I've often spoken in concerts and elsewhere, has existed in me side by side with my deep attachment to the cause of my own race. Some people have seen a contradiction in this duality. I do not, however, see my sentiments as contradictory." Now, if the reviewer had trouble understanding how one personality could embrace both, it's not entirely his fault. Few have managed to do it. In political terms, one can think of the Jewish Bund, which did not survive the Holocaust, although national Jewish movements from Hasidism to Zionism did. In Robeson's view, the early Soviet Union had squared the circle by respecting cultural autonomy and insisting on the equal humanity of all cultures. The question, how could Robeson defend the Soviet Union, is usually asked rhetorically or answered with weak nationalist apologetics, which were foreign to his thought. In this lecture, I've taken this question seriously, trying to understand why a man of such mental and moral stature could make what now seems a major historical error will inevitably lead someone to call me an an apologist for Stalinism, and it's probably useless to insist that I'm not. A statement that I'm not now, nor have I ever been a member of the Communist Party, which is true, would probably be dismissed as quickly as the assurances of those who were required to swear it before the HUAC. Americans, and to a lesser extent Britons, and Germans have begun to remember the racist history we tried to forget for so many years. But we've yet to confront our political history, especially surrounding the Cold War. Excellent historians, some of whom are sitting in this room, have written about it, but their work has yet to penetrate to the general public. As a Russian colleague once told me, unlike Americans, Soviet citizens knew they were hearing propaganda. Isolated from the rest of the world by geography and language, Americans usually don't. The linguistically talented Robeson doubtless knew many things that the American and British press did not print. How hungry is everybody? Just about done. And we can also talk over lunch rather than stringing out here. That's why I've written about Truman's decision to bomb Hiroshima against the recommendation of all his leading generals, who argued that it was unnecessary to win the war, something Truman himself declared in the New York Times in late August 1945. Like much of the world, Robeson suspected that the military unnecessary strike, which killed 150,000 in an instant, was in fact a signal to Stalin. He also knew, unlike most in the US and Western Europe, that it was the Red Army that broke the back of the Wehrmacht. With 27 million civilian and military casualties, the Soviet Union suffered most in the fight against Stalinism. By the way, that really was something I had to come to Germany in 1982 to learn. I just had no idea that, the 400,000 casualties of the greatest generation, I mean, in honor to all of them, but they didn't quite match up to the 14 million military casualties of the Red Army and many, many civilians. Knowledge of Soviet sacrifices produces the kind of loyalty that's hard to dislodge, and post-war US policy did nothing whatsoever to dislodge it. On the contrary, in April 1945, on Churchill's orders, the British Foreign Office produced a contingency plan for attacking Russia in July. Shortly after the war, the US made common cause with the Nazis because, after all, if you want really fervent anti-communists, especially with experience fighting on the Eastern Front, who else do you turn to? Reinhard Gehlen, who worked for the CIA before heading West Germany's intelligence service, was only the most famous of the millions of old Nazis who peopled the courts, the schools, the universities, the police forces, and other West German offices in the 3 decades after the war's end. At the time, it was well known that anti-Semitism was only one pillar of Nazi ideology. The Holocaust hardly played a role at Nuremberg. Anti-communism at Nuremberg was the most important. And though Spain was initially shunned after the war's end, Truman convinced the UN to admit the country that Franco still ruled with dictatorial force. Supporters of the Spanish Republic saw once again that the West would support fascism as long as it served the fight against communism. But this time, the fighters were not armed with the incendiary weapons that destroyed Guernica, but hydrogen bombs. As Robeson put it, gently, the fact that his outlook on world affairs was formed abroad is, quote, a key to understanding why I may differ with many others of my generation. Robeson's extensive reading and travels gave him perspective that few Americans possessed. It's painful to read how many black establishment readers succumbed to the nativism that used Robeson's years in Europe as an argument against him. Somewhat less gently, Robeson told a New York symposium called The Artist as Citizen that there is but one choice, back to fascism or on to socialism, and the sooner we get in step with the rest of the world, the sooner we will commence to straighten out our own problems, end quote. And while Americans fought bravely against fascism during 4 years of war, the government's position both before and after was far more disturbing than many remember. But when America did join the war effort, Robeson threw himself into it, refusing an invitation to give a concert at Roosevelt's White House because of Roosevelt's foot-dragging on integration, but supporting the campaign to re-elect him. That is, far from being naive, he took a grown-up position, and the one he held all his life. When there was war, he was on whatever side was fighting fascism. During the Cold War, it seemed clear which to avoid, the one that, for the first time in history, had used nuclear weapons. It's often charged that the Soviet Union was using the anti-colonial movements and the fight against segregation in America for its own geopolitical purposes, and that was surely true. The claim was not only widespread in political circles, but in popular American films like The Red Menace, available on YouTube. Interesting to watch. It's worth remembering, however, that this pressure played a helpful role not only in major Supreme Court decisions, but also in President Kennedy's decision to support the civil rights movement and send federal troops to Mississippi in 1963. As Robeson himself put it in Here I Stand, some people say that Soviet support of anti-colonialism is merely a matter of playing politics. But wouldn't it be wonderful for colored people everywhere if the U.S. delegation in the UN also played politics that way? It's a paradox in search of analysis. Even as Stalinist repression sabotaged the Soviet Union, communism was often on the right side of history. As Victor reminded us, Edward Said, while acknowledging that its interests were often instrumental, wrote, "Nearly every successful Third World liberation movement after World War II was helped by..." Did I say something? Okay. Said. Nearly every successful Third World liberation movement after World War II was helped by the Soviet Union's counterbalancing influence against the United States, Britain, France, Portugal, and Holland. American, British, and French governments publicly scorned Soviet statements supporting peace and decolonization as propaganda ploys. Privately, they worried that they'd lost the initiative on world peace. The U.S. made considerable efforts to manage its image abroad. Unfortunately, despite sending over jazz ambassadors, recently declassified documents show that at the same time as the U.S. was trying to upgrade its image with CIA-sponsored cultural programs, the Strategic Air Command was contemplating just which cities would be among the 1,000 targets slated for nuclear destruction in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and China, and one in each city is simply designated civilian. Under circumstances that both sides could reasonably regard as verging on war that would destroy the planet, one can understand why Robeson took the same course he'd taken a decade before. Remaining silent about abuses in the Soviet Union, as he'd restrained his criticisms of the U.S. during World War II, he stood on the side of those he held least wrong against those he saw as most dangerous. Not much enigma there. Black people like Du Bois and Robeson, who connected black liberation with universal struggles which challenged systemic policies, bore the brunt of systemic wrath. I've taken Robeson at his word, which means viewing him as the anti-fascist and socialist he called himself, rather than seeking a nationalist apology for his support of the Soviet Union. African Americans were first in his heart, but he loved many others, and he fought for a world in which all would be equal. He lost, and so did we. Robeson's birthday became an occasion for international revels, as we've heard. At the 1944 party attended by some 2,000 people, the playwright Mark Connolly said, "Robeson represents a highly desirable tomorrow, which by some lucky accident we are privileged to witness today." Robeson was a threat because he served as a reminder of what socialism stood for. No one better personified the universal solidarity and contempt for material values which were its promise. I trust my discussion will not be confused with a wholesale justification of the dictatorships that reigned in Eastern Europe in the name of state socialism for nearly half a century, still less of the misnamed People's Republic of China, which has managed to combine the very worst features of both communism and capitalism. I've tried instead to understand how people of the greatest intelligence and integrity might, through a combination of forces, be led down a path we will condemn today. Condemn today, not condemn. Yet I still do not know what I would have done in his shoes, and I'm glad I need not make his choices. I think understanding those choices is crucial to understanding the history of the 20th century, so sorely needed today. For the post-Cold War order's consensus that any form of socialism leads to terror has prevented us from asking, in broad dialogues, if another form is possible. The Soviet Union's betrayal of the principles that led so many to defend it rendered the principles themselves without much of a home. Those who refuse to acknowledge anything of value in its history are thus left preferring tribal identities, however reactionary or fanatical, over universalist ones which might contain seeds of socialism. We've yet to recover from the U.S. support for the Taliban or Benjamin Netanyahu's support for Hamas, and we've certainly yet to learn from it. Are we still living in a worldview that thinks it's better dead than red? Thank you.
Questions for Susan?
But we're also hungry, so Nell, please.
So,
Thank you.
so
Actually, that makes me feel really.
so first now.
Thank you, Susan. That makes me. There are a lot of people here I respect, but now I feel like I can finish this book, filling that piece out of it with a good conscience.
Go ahead. Finish that book. Yes. Everybody's saying marvelous, but I want to say just one thing about the spirituals. The spirituals were in bourgeois black culture from the time of the Fisk singers in the 1860s and 70s. So they've always been popular. So that's just one tiny thing.
Thank you. Okay, I'll correct that. I'm trying to think of where I...
popular as well, right? Which you kind of get at. Or actually the last one.
The Fisk.
But wasn't it Robeson, I think it was 1924, who gave the first public concert?
Especially the 20s, James Alden Johnson.
Okay.
25.
Thank you.
It's small, but it's important.
It is important, thank you. No, any corrections or pushback, large or small, I'm happy to hear.
It may not be on, Susan. You may have to just flick it. Yeah, okay.
There's one, maybe just a continuation, is I think so many people attach the word tragic, whatever your, either taking your point of view or somebody else's point of view, that word always still creeps in. I'm not saying it did with your presentation. Or did he lose? And a kind of victimization undertone, though, to his life. And I think stepping back, especially for younger generations today, that he never saw himself as a victim. I can tell you that, and I can tell you that from adults who were around him. I once asked Harry, very Belafonte, very neutrally. Do you think Paul ever saw himself as a victim? He, at the age of 80 whatever, or 90 something, he practically fell off the chair laughing. It's just the conception did not fit. He didn't have that paradigm or framework to see himself that way. And so I just think that's an important thing to always present, that he was not a tragic figure. And lose, win, or whatever, I think because the legacy still lives, and if you look at the legacy as a living legacy, that no, I don't feel he lost. Or, and also the way he saw his life. He had no regrets, because I remember coming up, the line was, well, wasn't he bitter? Or when he came back in '63, he was a bitter, broken man, But bitter was always there. And I used to think about that as a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, and I came to the conclusion that if you have no regrets, which I knew for a fact he didn't, then you're never going to be bitter. And you never have lost. And that was, to me, the bottom line. And I think I still hear that framework of tragic, lost, and underneath it, you figure there's victim and bitter.
Thank you so much. And if you'll allow me, I might send you the whole draft of this chapter when it gets done and ask you to correct me. This is actually why...
And that's a hero, sorry, to me.
Correct. And this is actually why I chose to end the book with him, because he has always struck me as someone who might have some genuine claims to having been a victim of in all kinds of ways, and who never projected that. I agree with you. I agree that, the fact one of his favorite songs to sing was one of mine. Actually, one of my other heroes is John Brown, and portraying this was, his soul goes marching on. And I think that has always been my sense from what I've read. Howsomever, so I'm so glad to hear that from you. When I said he lost, I meant in the context, first of all, that in the 30s and 40s, there was a very American socialist movement, so that, the ballot for Americans could be sung at the Communist and the Republican Party conventions. And you may know, if you don't, everybody go download it or buy the CD. That's Why We're Marching, which is a wonderful CD. Woody Guthrie, Sonny Terry, Brownie McGee, Pete Seeger, Josh White, and you can trace the Americanness of the labor movement of the 30s, with Woody singing things like, "Our union's gonna tear them fascists down, down, down," and, or is it Round Hitler's Grave, I think Sonny Terry. I mean, so there was, you know, we have the picture of Robeson and Einstein with Henry Wallace speaking for the Henry Wallace campaign on this month's program. So this season's Einstein Forum program. So, you know, we're going to have a long way to go. I'm trying to do a little bit of what I can to get back that promise that he represented and fought for so hard. And of course, you know, they destroyed him physically. And I am so happy to hear that Harry Belafonte nearly fell off his chair when you asked him that question, because, you know, I've seen the last picture. And having seen so many other extraordinary pictures in your book, it's of a man who has undergone, you know, I mean, somebody put it, the combined forces of the United States were after his destruction. But I'm just very glad to hear that. Thank you.
Corey, right? Did you want to ask? Yeah,
hopefully very quickly. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, are we good? Sorry, now it might be too loud. I was thinking about this framework and thinking that even as you sort of qualify that you're not speaking as a historian, I think you're building on a historical tradition that puts someone like Robeson as a hero, so that in some ways you're actually almost reading more historically rather than sort of reading ahistorically for thinking about him in those terms. I can give you some sources if you'd like, but I think I think in some ways it could be apt to remember that there were people who were putting him on this plane, and we've sort of overlooked that tradition.
So, yes.
So just a couple small things. Hopefully this isn't too academic, but also thinking about history in particular, there's a reason why historians moved past this sort of story of like heroes as a means of sort of telling history. And so I'm curious how you see your work as sort of in conversation with that, as in like, are you representing something different in your focus on heroes versus what has come before? The second would be a more open-ended, I think related sort of thought about what would a feminist analysis of that narrative look like that you've created? Thank you.
I get that question a lot.
I think there's a reason, but...
You know, look, first of all, I think there's as good an answer to the question, why are there fewer women in, you know, traditional heroic histories, as there's an answer to the question, why are there so few women philosophers? I'm completely against, you know, people who, you know, find notebooks of Descartes' little sister or second cousin who, might have been as great as, you know, if she'd been allowed to get an education. I don't think that we improve, that we fight back against, you know, either sexism or anything else by not telling history for the way things are. Yes, women were heroes, and I don't think hero is a male category. I know that there's some feminists who do. I will have some things to say about that in the book, but that's just very briefly, okay? The bigger question, maybe we can talk over lunch, because I know some people, including me, are rather hungry. Yeah, I, of course, engage with, and I'm, because I just write for general audiences. I try to learn from as many other people as I can, but I won't engage with, you know, the whole discussion of the movement away from the great man theory of, I mean, I'll talk about it. But I think that while I completely think it was not just an advance in historical thinking and historical writing, but an advance in justice, you know, not just simply to forget people who were victims of history, saying, well, shit happens, what counted were the people who survived. While it was an advance in justice, we've gone way too far the other way. And one of my other heroes, he's not coming up in this book, but one of my other heroes is a very, very brilliant Austrian secular Jewish writer named Jean-Marie, otherwise known as Hans Meyer, but he changed his name to a French anagram after he survived 2 years in Auschwitz, and wrote the most searing book that I've ever read about that experience. It's not gory, but it's intellectually searing. But then wrote in his later life some best defenses of the Enlightenment that I've ever read. So he's my guy. Amaury wrote that he didn't even think there should be monuments to the victims of the Holocaust. He said to be a victim is not an honor. Now, I would not go as far as Amaury went, much as I admire him, but we have gone in the direction of disengaging legitimacy from what people do in the world and making it turn on what the world does to us. And while I'm not entirely sure that I've had the answer to that, and you know, I mean, all you have to do is look at Donald Trump to see where this goes to. No, victim. He never talks about his, you know, yeah, victim. Anyway, but thanks for the questions, and I'll be interested in your references. Margaret, last question.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you so much. So first of all, I appreciate your argument about heroes and victims. I don't know that it's as well connected with your presentation of the choices that Robeson faced and the decisions that he made, as I might want to. Maybe when I read it, I will see it.
Maybe you can.
Clearly.
Maybe you can tell me what I need to explain, so because it's not finished yet.
That's just one point. And then here, I just want to play. I want to just push back a little bit in a devil's advocate sort of way, and say, you know, you're right that we're all adults and we all have, you know, lines that we have to measure and figure out where our line is. But it's also true that at some point you will reach a line that, okay, most people, reasonable people, would not cross. You know, they would not vote for that person. And I think you fudge that in this paper in a little bit, in saying, you know, what Robeson did is explicable in, you know, many, many ways. And it's a choice that many, many people would have and should have and would have made. I think that's essentially I think what it is you're saying.
Yeah, that it was a reasonable, well thought choice,
Okay.
and not something that was naive or, you know,
Yeah,
foolish.
and I think I get all that. I think you also have to say something about what was going on in the CPUSA. I mean, he was making that choice in the context of choices that many, many other people were making. And for him and for lots of folks, it was the right choice, but for others it wasn't. I mean, he wasn't an individual thinking back on his time in the Soviet Union or in London or in Wales and considering, okay, this is the right choice for me. He was also, like everybody, he's making it in the context of what a party is doing. Maybe even if he's not a member of the party, it's a party that, you know, has kind of a point of view. And so I didn't see, I think you have to deal with that in some way. And then the final thing I want to say is Kennedy did not send anyone to Mississippi in 1963. He did not send troops to Mississippi.
For James Meredith.
What?
James Meredith. James Meredith, 30,000 people protected James Meredith from white supremacist rioters.
Was that 60?
And I had the good fortune to... interview James Meredith. So,
Okay, I stay corrected.
of course, since James Meredith doesn't always, is not always a great authority, I have also checked that, his sources too.
Sorry.
Thanks, Margaret. I'll get back to you.
There's a couple of questions on the chat. They were kind of asked. They're also, okay. What happens when the ordinary people in search of a public history are not alive anymore? In other words, when we search for a public history of a time that has now passed, can we make distinctions between history with archives and public history? Okay.
Yeah, I think that, historians who do work in archives are doing a service to all of us. But, I often wish that some books from whom I've learned, even from more than one person in this room, will go unmentioned, could benefit from being written in a form that was publicly accessible. So.
May I just add something for historians?
I'm not dumping.
Which is that I'm not speaking,
We need you.
no, I'm not speaking against you. I just want to add something to what you're saying because there's a larger conversation out there that says the archive is no good, it's always been anti-black and so forth. But what I'm hearing from historians is that what constitutes the archive has changed dramatically in the last 40, 50 years. So we have many more sources. And when you ask about how to find the views of ordinary people, so 40 or 50 years ago, we could go to newspapers, but now through digitization, we can look at pension records, we can look at genealogy. So there's just so much more.
Thank you, Nell. And I should say here, by the way, that Nell Painter is not one of the historians I would ever, suggest was writing too academically. She somehow manages to combine this very careful use of sources with very good prose. So that's a model. You're a model for many people.
Okay, I think.
Was there another?
Yeah, there's two more.
But can we maybe hold them because we're already running late? So maybe we can ask them at a later point, or we can communicate them to Susan over lunch. Okay.
Sorry.
I'd like to thank Susan again for her talk.